Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe and one share.
She called me cool mom. Have you ever smiled for an entire day because of just 2 words? It sounds impossible, doesn't it? I used to believe that teenagers only noticed the things parents did wrong. They rolled their eyes, disappeared behind closed bedroom doors, answered with one-word replies, and somehow made us question whether we were doing anything right at all. But one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my son's friend looked at me, laughed, and said, "You're such a cool mom." I smiled. But what happened inside my heart surprised me even more. Those 2 simple words carried years of invisible effort that nobody had ever seen. If you've ever wondered whether your family notices your love, whether your children secretly appreciate the little things you do every day, or whether kindness still matters in today's busy American life, stay with me. This story changed the way I see motherhood, marriage, and even the simple English words we hear every day. And strangely enough, it all started with a frozen pizza, a messy kitchen, and 2 words I never expected to hear. My name is Emma, and this really changed me. I live an ordinary life in the United States with my husband and our teenage son. Nothing about our family looks extraordinary from the outside. We both work hard. We argue about whose turn it is to unload the dishwasher. We forget grocery lists. We laugh over silly television shows. Like many parents in America, we spend more time worrying than celebrating. Is our son spending too much time on his phone? Is he eating enough vegetables? Are we giving him enough freedom without letting him make dangerous mistakes? These questions never seem to disappear. If you're raising teenagers in the United States today, you probably understand exactly what I mean. People often imagine that being a cool parent means saying yes to everything. Bigger allowance, no curfew, unlimited screen time. That couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, many family counselors say teenagers actually feel safer when parents create clear but respectful boundaries. They may complain today, but consistent support builds trust over time. I didn't know that years ago. I learned it through mistakes, awkward conversations, and many quiet evenings wondering if I had completely failed as a mother. So when my son's friend called me cool mom, I almost looked behind me to see if she was talking to someone else. Because honestly, I had never been trying to be cool. I was simply trying to be present. Every Friday after school, our house becomes surprisingly noisy. Shoes pile up near the front door. Someone opens the refrigerator every 5 minutes even though nothing new appears inside. The smell of popcorn somehow reaches every room. Laughter travels upstairs faster than any music. I never planned for our home to become the favorite meeting place, but it happened little by little. I learned something important about teenagers in America. They don't expect a perfect house. They don't care if your couch is expensive. They remember how home makes them feel. Safe, welcome, respected, seen. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't building a perfect home. I was building a place where nobody felt judged. Without realizing it, I was also learning English in the most natural way possible. Small conversations, simple questions, everyday expressions. Help yourself. Be careful. Have a good one. Dinner's almost ready. Those ordinary sentences slowly became part of my life without memorizing endless vocabulary lists. Language stopped feeling like homework and started feeling like connection. But none of that explains why those 2 words almost made me cry. Because what my son's friend didn't know was that only a few months earlier, I had quietly asked myself a painful question while standing alone in this same kitchen. Am I becoming invisible in my own family? It was a question I never dared to say out loud. And the answer I thought I knew was completely wrong. That afternoon was about to prove it in the most unexpected way imaginable. Everything changed because of one sentence spoken by someone who wasn't even my child. And before that moment ended, I would discover something about teenagers, marriage, and family that I wish someone had told me years earlier. Maybe by the end of this story, you'll see your own family a little differently too. My house, their safe place. The strangest part wasn't that my son's friend called me cool mom. The strangest part was what happened 5 minutes later. I accidentally overheard another teenager whisper, "I wish my mom understood me like yours does." I froze with a bowl of popcorn still in my hands. My first reaction wasn't pride. It was disbelief. Were they really talking about me? The same woman who had spent months wondering whether her teenage son even enjoyed being around her? The same mother who had gone to bed more than once thinking she was saying all the wrong things? That single sentence opened a door to memories I hadn't planned to revisit, because the truth is much less exciting than people imagine. There was no secret parenting book. No magical family rule. No perfect marriage. No perfect son. Just hundreds of tiny decisions that nobody noticed at the time. Looking around my living room that afternoon, I saw backpacks tossed on the floor, half-finished sodas on the coffee table. A video game paused on the television, and 6 teenagers laughing so loudly I could barely hear myself think. Some parents might have seen a mess. I saw something completely different. They felt comfortable enough to be themselves in my home. In today's America, that is becoming more valuable than many parents realize. Teenagers spend countless hours online. They scroll through endless videos, compare themselves to strangers, and sometimes feel more connected to their phones than to the people sitting beside them. Mental health experts have often pointed out that young people need safe, judgment-free spaces where they can simply relax and talk. I never tried to compete with social media. I simply wanted my house to become one of those places. That didn't mean I acted like one of the kids. In fact, I learned that teenagers usually don't want another teenager pretending to be their friend. They want an adult who is calm, predictable, respectful, and available when life suddenly becomes confusing. Our family has a few simple rules. Everyone says hello when they come inside. Everyone knows where the snacks are without asking permission. Everyone can charge their phone in the kitchen. Everyone is welcome to stay for dinner if they call home first. And perhaps the most important rule of all, no one gets laughed at for asking an honest question. That last rule changed more lives than I expected. One afternoon, one of my son's friends quietly asked me how to cook scrambled eggs because nobody had ever shown him. Another day, a different teenager wanted advice about apologizing after arguing with his father. Sometimes they asked about college. Sometimes they asked about jobs. Sometimes they asked nothing at all. They simply sat at our kitchen island eating pizza because silence can also feel safe when you're surrounded by people who don't expect you to perform. My husband used to smile every time the doorbell rang. "Looks like we're feeding half the neighborhood again," he would joke. I always laughed because he wasn't wrong. Our grocery bill certainly noticed. But somewhere between frozen pizzas, homemade cookies, basketball games on television, and late-night conversations, I realized something surprising. Being a cool mom had absolutely nothing to do with trying to impress teenagers. It came from treating them with the same respect I hoped they would show other people. That lesson quietly changed my marriage too. My husband and I stopped trying to prove who was the better parent. Instead, we focused on becoming a team. When one of us became frustrated, the other stepped in with patience instead of criticism. Teenagers notice far more than adults think. They watch how couples disagree. They notice whether parents interrupt each other. They remember whether home feels peaceful or tense. I didn't understand that years ago, but I certainly understand it now. Looking back, I also realized these everyday conversations became the best English lessons I had ever experienced. Nobody corrected every sentence I spoke. Nobody handed me grammar worksheets. I simply listened, answered naturally, and repeated useful expressions until they became part of my daily life. Phrases like, make yourself at home, take your time, no worries, and help yourself slowly became effortless because they were connected to real moments instead of classroom exercises. Language became part of family life, not another subject to study. Still, one question refused to leave my mind after hearing those teenagers talk. If they truly felt this comfortable in my home, why had my own son never told me? Did he secretly agree with them? Or was there something he had been waiting years to say? I had no idea that before the week was over, he would answer that question in front of everyone. And what he said would make those 2 words, cool mom, mean even more than I ever imagined. The marriage behind my smile. Most people believe the happiest woman in the room must also have the happiest marriage. I used to smile and let them believe it because the truth was much harder to explain. A peaceful home isn't built because 2 people never disagree. Sometimes it's built because they learn how to disagree without making everyone else feel unsafe. A few days after my son's friend called me cool mom, I was washing dishes when I heard my son laughing with his friends in the backyard. One of them joked, "Your parents never yell." My son answered so quickly that I almost dropped the plate in my hands. "Oh, they argue," he said. "They just don't make us carry it." I stood completely still. My heart started beating faster because he had described something his father and I had spent years trying to protect without ever telling him. At that moment, I realized children see much more than we think, but thankfully, they don't always remember the arguments. They remember how those arguments end. Years ago, my husband and I made a promise after one particularly exhausting disagreement. We weren't angry about anything dramatic. It wasn't money. It wasn't trust. It wasn't another person. It was something almost embarrassingly ordinary. I wanted every family dinner to happen at exactly 6 o'clock. He believed dinner could wait if our son wanted to finish basketball practice or homework first. It sounds ridiculous now. But small disagreements have a strange way of becoming much bigger when 2 tired adults stop listening and start trying to win. That evening we both noticed our son quietly carrying his plate upstairs before we had even finished talking. He wasn't crying. He wasn't upset. He simply wanted to escape the tension. That image stayed with me longer than the argument itself. Later that night, my husband looked at me and quietly said, "I don't want him to remember our voices louder than our love." I never forgot those words. They became one of the simplest, but strongest rules in our marriage. We didn't promise never to argue again because that would have been unrealistic. Every healthy relationship has disagreements. Instead, we promised something much more practical. If emotions became too high, one of us would say, "Let's finish this later." Not because the conversation wasn't important, but because our family deserved peace more than either of us deserved the last word. Surprisingly, relationship experts often explain something similar. Children generally don't become anxious because they occasionally see conflict. They become anxious when conflict feels endless, unpredictable, or unresolved. Respectful communication teaches emotional safety better than pretending problems never exist. Looking back now, I think that simple habit quietly shaped our son's understanding of relationships. He learned that love doesn't mean perfection. It means choosing respect even when emotions are complicated. I noticed another change too. His friends seemed unusually relaxed around us. They teased each other, laughed loudly, admitted mistakes, and sometimes even asked our opinions about things teenagers usually keep secret. One afternoon, a friend admitted he hated going home after school because every conversation in his house sounded like an argument waiting to happen. Nobody around the table knew what to say. I simply poured him another glass of lemonade and changed the subject. Sometimes kindness isn't giving advice. Sometimes it's giving someone one peaceful afternoon they didn't know they needed. My husband later whispered, maybe that's why they all keep coming back. I think he was right. Our home wasn't exciting because we had expensive furniture or the newest technology. It felt different because nobody had to walk on eggshells. That lesson quietly influenced the way I spoke English too. In the beginning, I worried about making mistakes every time I opened my mouth. Then I realized conversations aren't competitions. People care far more about sincerity than perfect grammar. I started speaking more naturally, using simple expressions that fit everyday family life. How was your day? Take your time. I'm proud of you. We'll figure it out together. Those ordinary sentences carried more warmth than any complicated vocabulary list ever could. Language slowly became another way to build connection instead of another reason to feel nervous. But the biggest surprise was still waiting for me. That weekend, my husband smiled and asked a question I hadn't expected to hear in years. Do you know why our son actually enjoys bringing his friends here? I thought I already knew the answer. I was completely wrong. What he told me next made me see those two little words, cool mom, from an entirely different perspective, and for the first time, I realized the compliment had never really been about me at all. Parenting isn't about control. You know why my friends like coming here? My husband asked as he leaned against the kitchen counter, watching our son laugh through the backyard window. I smiled confidently because I thought I already knew the answer. Because we have good snacks? I joked. He laughed and slowly shook his head. No, he said. Because nobody here is trying to control them. His words landed much harder than I expected. For a moment, I wanted to disagree. I wasn't controlling. I was responsible. At least, that's what I had always told myself. Every parent wants to protect their child. Every parent worries. Every parent imagines the worst-case scenario before their teenager even leaves the driveway. That's love, isn't it? But over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to something I had never noticed before. Every time one of my son's friends walked into our house, I greeted them the same way. Hi, glad you're here. Then I went back to whatever I had been doing. I didn't immediately ask about grades. I didn't question where their parents were. I didn't demand to know every detail of their plans. I trusted that if something important came up, the conversation would happen naturally. And surprisingly, it usually did. One afternoon, while I was slicing apples in the kitchen, one of the boys wandered in and asked, "Can I help?" I handed him a knife and a cutting board. We worked quietly for a minute before he suddenly said, "My mom checks my location every 15 minutes. I looked up, unsure whether he wanted advice or simply wanted someone to hear him. Does that bother you? I asked gently. He shrugged. It's not the tracking, he admitted. It's that she never believes me when I tell her where I am. That sentence stayed with me long after he left. Trust. That was the word quietly hiding behind the entire conversation. Parenting experts often explain that teenagers become more honest when they believe the truth will be met with calm conversation instead of immediate punishment. Fear may produce obedience for a while, but trust creates communication that lasts much longer. Looking back, I realized my own parenting had slowly changed over the years. I used to ask endless questions the moment my son walked through the door. Where were you? Who was there? What did you eat? Did you finish your homework? He answered politely enough, but every conversation felt like an interview. One evening, after a particularly long list of questions, he smiled and quietly asked, "Mom, do you want to know about my day, or do you want to inspect it?" I laughed at the time because his question sounded clever. Later that night, however, I realized he had unintentionally taught me one of the biggest lessons of motherhood. There is a difference between curiosity and control. The next afternoon, I tried something different. When he came home, I simply smiled and asked, "What was the best part of your day?" He looked surprised. Then he started talking. Not for 30 seconds. Not for 1 minute. Nearly 20 minutes. He told me about a joke in science class, a difficult math test, a friend who was nervous before football practice, and even a funny conversation at lunch. I barely asked another question. He kept talking because he felt heard instead of examined. That simple change transformed our relationship more than I could have imagined. My husband noticed it too. "See," he whispered later that evening. "People don't open doors that someone is trying to kick down." He was right. Conversations work the same way. Around the same time, I realized this lesson was helping my English improve in an unexpected way. Instead of worrying about speaking perfectly, I focused on listening carefully. I discovered that real conversations aren't built with impressive vocabulary. They're built with simple questions that invite people to share their lives. How did that make you feel? Tell me more. What happened next? Those everyday expressions appeared naturally because I genuinely wanted to understand people, not because I was practicing grammar. Slowly, my confidence grew without me even noticing. Meanwhile, our house continued filling with teenagers almost every weekend. They laughed, played games, finished homework together, raided the refrigerator, and somehow always ended up around our kitchen island before going home. Watching them, I finally understood something many families in America quietly value. Teenagers don't expect adults to be perfect. They simply hope to find adults who make them feel respected. That realization made the compliment, "cool mom," sound completely different inside my heart. It wasn't about being funny. It wasn't about acting younger than my age. It wasn't about saying yes to everything. It was about creating a place where young people could breathe. But I still didn't know the real reason my own son had never reacted when his friends called me that. I thought perhaps he hadn't even heard them. I couldn't have been more mistaken. The truth was waiting for me only a few days later, and when my son finally spoke about it himself, I realized he had been watching me far more carefully than I had ever been watching him. The afternoon that changed everything. I honestly believe the story had already reached its happiest moment. After all, how often does a teenager casually call someone's mom "cool mom"? I thought that was the ending. I couldn't have been more wrong. The real surprise happened 3 days later, and this time the person who completely caught me off guard wasn't my son's friend. It was my own son. If someone had secretly recorded what happened that afternoon and played it back for me a year earlier, I would have laughed and said, "That would never happen in my house." Yet life has a funny habit of rewarding the things we stop expecting. It was a quiet Saturday. The weather was perfect, the backyard was full of laughter, and the smell of hamburgers drifted through the open windows while my husband stood proudly in front of the grill pretending he was hosting a television cooking show. Inside, I was arranging bowls of chips and fruit on the kitchen island when I noticed something unusual. My son's friends weren't rushing to the backyard like they normally did. Instead, they were standing around the kitchen talking with me. One asked where I bought the homemade lemonade. Another wanted the cookie recipe. Someone else asked if I had always enjoyed cooking. We laughed about burnt pancakes, failed birthday cakes, and the mystery of why teenagers can empty an entire refrigerator in less than 10 minutes. It felt so ordinary that I almost missed the moment everything changed. Then my son walked into the kitchen, looked around at everyone, smiled, and said something I had never heard before. "See? I told you she'd make you feel at home." The room became strangely quiet, at least inside my own mind. Those weren't dramatic words. They weren't part of a speech. They weren't meant to impress anyone. In fact, he said them so naturally that I don't think he realized how deeply they affected me. I turned toward him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking. There wasn't one. He grabbed a bottle of water, smiled again, and continued talking with his friends as if nothing important had happened. But for me, everything had changed. For years, I had wondered whether my efforts mattered. Parents rarely receive report cards. There are no annual performance reviews. No certificates that say, you're doing better than you think. Most of the time we simply keep showing up, hoping the small things count. Packing lunches. Waiting after sports practice. Listening to stories that don't always seem important. Remembering favorite snacks. Staying awake until everyone gets home safely. These moments often feel invisible because nobody applauds them. Yet somehow they become the foundation children quietly build their memories upon. Researchers who study family relationships often describe something called emotional security. Children and teenagers may not remember every conversation, but they remember how consistently safe, accepted, and valued they felt inside their home. Looking back, I realized I had spent years focusing on whether I was saying the perfect words, when the real answer had always been hidden inside ordinary routines. Home isn't remembered because everything goes perfectly. Home is remembered because people know they belong there. My husband walked into the kitchen a few minutes later carrying a plate of hamburgers. He looked at me and immediately noticed something was different. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I laughed because my eyes had suddenly filled with tears for absolutely no dramatic reason. "I'm fine," I whispered. "I just heard something I didn't know I needed to hear." He didn't ask another question. He simply squeezed my hand for a second before returning outside. That's another thing marriage has taught me over the years. Sometimes love isn't about finding the perfect response. Sometimes it's recognizing that silence can hold gratitude just as beautifully as words. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the house had finally become quiet again, I kept replaying my son's sentence in my mind. "She'd make you feel at home." It wasn't about the food. It wasn't about the games. It wasn't about having the biggest television or the nicest backyard. My son hadn't introduced me as the funniest mom or the coolest cook. He had introduced me as someone who helped people feel comfortable. Somehow, that meant more than I can describe. Around the same time, I noticed something else that made me smile. Without planning it, I had been practicing English through moments exactly like these. I wasn't memorizing complicated grammar rules anymore. I was using simple, warm expressions every day. "Come on in. Make yourself comfortable. Can I get you something to drink? You're always welcome here." Those sentences became effortless because they carried genuine kindness instead of classroom pressure. I realized that language grows much faster when it's connected to real relationships. Every conversation became another small lesson without ever feeling like study. But that peaceful Saturday wasn't completely over yet. As I finished cleaning the kitchen, I noticed something folded on the counter beside the empty cookie plate. It looked like an ordinary piece of notebook paper. I almost threw it away without opening it. Thankfully, I didn't. Because the message written inside would explain why my son's friends had started calling me cool mom long before I ever heard those words myself. And what I read made me sit down before I could even finish the first sentence. Why those two words hurt first. For a second, I honestly thought it was a grocery list someone had forgotten. The folded notebook paper looked ordinary, almost too ordinary to deserve my attention. But when I unfolded it, the first sentence stopped me cold. It read, "Thank you for making your house feel like the safest place after school." There was no name at the bottom. No signature. Just a few short sentences written in the messy handwriting of a teenager. I read them once. Then again. Then a third time. Somehow, the words became heavier every time I looked at them. The note continued, "Some of us don't smile much until we get here." Please don't stop doing what you're doing. It matters more than you know. I sat down without even realizing it. A few minutes earlier, I had been wiping crumbs off the kitchen counter. Now I was trying to understand why complete strangers' children had described my home as a safe place. Suddenly, being called cool mom didn't feel exciting anymore. It felt deeply emotional. And strangely, it hurt before it healed. Not because the words were unkind, but because they forced me to admit something I had hidden from myself for years. I had never believed I was enough. Isn't that funny? People often think confidence comes from praise. In reality, many parents become experts at doubting themselves. We remember every impatient answer, every forgotten school event, every dinner that came from the freezer because we were exhausted after work. We rarely remember the thousands of ordinary moments when we quietly showed love without expecting recognition. Psychologists sometimes call this negativity bias. Our brains naturally hold on to mistakes longer than successes because they are trying to protect us from repeating them. That may help us survive danger, but it doesn't help us appreciate ourselves. Looking back, I realized I had spent years collecting evidence against myself. If my son closed his bedroom door, I wondered whether I had upset him. If he wanted to spend Saturday with friends, I questioned whether I had become boring. If he answered with one word instead of 10, I assumed I had lost our connection. I never considered a much simpler explanation. Maybe he was just being a perfectly normal teenager. Maybe I wasn't failing nearly as badly as I imagined. That anonymous note quietly challenged every negative story I had been telling myself. Later that evening, my husband found me reading it again. He smiled before I even looked up. "You found it," he said. I blinked in surprise. "You knew this was here?" He nodded. One of the kids slipped it onto the counter before they left. "I saw him do it, but I thought you deserved to discover it yourself." I stared at him, completely speechless. "Why didn't you tell me?" He shrugged gently. "Because sometimes believing other people is easier when you find the evidence on your own." I laughed through tears because, once again, he understood me better than I understood myself. We've been married long enough to know that encouragement doesn't always arrive as a speech. Sometimes it arrives folded into a piece of notebook paper beside an empty cookie plate. My husband sat across from me and quietly admitted something that surprised me even more. "Do you know," he said, "our son has been inviting more friends over every year because he says this house feels calm?" Calm. Such a simple word. Not exciting. Not perfect. Not luxurious. Calm. I suddenly realized that teenagers living in today's fast-moving world often carry pressures adults can't always see. School expectations. Social media. Friendships. Sports. College dreams. Constant comparisons. Maybe what they wanted wasn't another source of entertainment. Maybe they simply wanted one place where nobody expected them to pretend. That thought stayed with me for days. It also changed the way I thought about learning English. For the longest time, I believed every sentence had to sound perfect before I spoke it. But these teenagers never cared whether I used advanced vocabulary. They cared whether I listened, whether I smiled, whether I made room for everyone at the table. Real communication had never depended on impressive words. It depended on making people feel comfortable enough to answer honestly. That's why some of the simplest expressions became my favorites. "I'm glad you're here. Take your time. You're always welcome." Those small sentences carried warmth far beyond their grammar. They reminded me that language is ultimately about human connection. Then my husband said something I wasn't prepared to hear. "There's one more thing you don't know." I looked up immediately. "What do you mean?" He smiled in that familiar way that told me he had been keeping a secret for quite some time. "The first person who started calling you cool mom wasn't your son's friend." I frowned, completely confused. Then who was it? He laughed softly. You should ask your son. Suddenly, my curiosity returned stronger than ever. I had spent days believing I finally understood the whole story, but once again, I had only seen a tiny piece of it. Whatever my son had been quietly hiding all this time was about to change the meaning of those two unforgettable words forever. What American families taught me. I couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, while my son was making breakfast before heading out with his friends, I decided to ask the question that had been living rent-free in my mind for days. I tried to sound casual, but my curiosity completely gave me away. Can I ask you something? He looked up from the toaster and smiled. Sure. I held up the folded note I had carefully placed back inside the kitchen drawer. Dad told me something interesting. He said the first person who ever called me cool mom wasn't Emma. He laughed immediately. Not a nervous laugh. The kind of laugh that says someone has been waiting for this conversation to happen. Then he looked straight at me and said, that's because. It was me. For a second, I honestly wondered if I had heard him correctly. You? I asked. He nodded while spreading butter across his toast, as though he had just said the most ordinary thing in the world. Yeah. I started saying it last year. My heart skipped a beat. Last year? That meant he had been calling me that long before I ever heard those words with my own ears. Why didn't you tell me? I asked quietly. He shrugged with that familiar teenage smile. Because if I said it directly, you'd probably tell me to clean my room and ruin the moment. I burst into laughter so hard that I nearly spilled my coffee. That joke sounded exactly like him. But then his expression became unexpectedly serious. Mom, he said, my friends ask why everyone likes hanging out here. I always tell them the same thing. I waited. Because you treat everyone like they belong. Those 7 words hit me even harder than cool mom. Suddenly, every tiny memory from the past few years began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. The extra chairs I always pulled up to the table. The way I learned everyone's favorite drinks without anyone asking. The birthday cupcakes I baked even for kids who weren't related to me. The rides home after football practice. The late-night grilled cheese sandwiches during exam week. None of those moments had seemed important on their own. Together, they had quietly become someone's definition of home. I realized something beautiful about many families here in the United States. While every household is different, one value often stands out, making people feel welcome without expecting them to be perfect. Some of the strongest family memories aren't created during expensive vacations or holiday celebrations. They're created on completely ordinary afternoons when someone walks through the front door and hears, "Come on in." Looking back, I noticed something else too. My son's friends always thanked me before leaving. They looked adults in the eye. They cleaned up after themselves without being asked twice. They respected our home because they felt respected inside it. Respect has a funny way of traveling in both directions. When adults offer it first, young people often return it naturally. Of course, not every day was peaceful. There were missed curfews, forgotten homework, muddy shoes on clean floors, empty milk cartons somehow returned to the refrigerator, and enough disappearing snacks to make me question whether teenagers secretly have 2 stomachs. But those small frustrations no longer felt like proof that something was wrong. They felt like evidence that our house was alive. My husband often joked that if the kitchen stayed perfectly clean all weekend, something must have gone terribly wrong because it meant nobody had visited. He wasn't entirely kidding. The laughter echoing through our home became far more valuable than spotless countertops. That simple realization also changed the way I viewed communication. Whether inside a family or while learning English, people remember feelings before they remember vocabulary. Nobody has ever walked out of my house praising my grammar. They remembered hearing simple phrases spoken sincerely. How are you doing? Take another cookie. Drive safely. Text your parents when you get home. These everyday expressions became part of my life because they carried genuine care instead of academic pressure. Without realizing it, I had been improving my English by building relationships, one conversation at a time. The words became natural because the emotions behind them were real. As I watched my son finish breakfast, I smiled and asked one final question. So, when did you decide I was a cool mom? He laughed again, but this time he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his backpack, walked toward the front door, then turned around with a grin I will never forget. It wasn't one moment, he said. It was every time my friends left smiling. Then he disappeared outside before I could respond. I stood there alone in the kitchen, holding my coffee, completely speechless. I thought I finally understood the story. Once again, I was wrong. Because later that afternoon, one unexpected visitor would ring our doorbell. And what that person came to tell me would reveal that my small acts of kindness had reached far beyond my own family, far enough to change another. Home in a way I never could have imagined. English came naturally. The doorbell rang just after 3 o'clock, and I almost didn't answer it. I assumed it was another delivery or one of my son's friends who had forgotten a backpack again. Instead, standing on my front porch was a woman I had only met a few times before. She was the mother of one of my son's closest friends. She smiled politely, but I could tell she hadn't come to borrow sugar or return a casserole dish. She was nervous. Parents recognize that look in other parents almost immediately. Do you have a few minutes? She asked softly. Something about her voice made me forget everything else I had planned for the afternoon. I invited her inside, made 2 cups of coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table where so many ordinary conversations had quietly changed my life. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then she looked around the room and smiled. Now I understand, she whispered. I frowned. Understand what? She took a deep breath before answering. Why my son always wants to come here. I didn't know what to say. I thought she was about to complain that he spent too much time at our house. Instead, she reached into her purse and unfolded a piece of paper. His English teacher asked the class to write about a place where they feel safe, she explained. My son wrote about your kitchen. I felt my heart stop for just a second. She continued reading a few lines aloud. When I'm at my friend's house, nobody expects me to pretend I'm okay. His mom smiles even when we're loud. She asks how we're doing and actually waits for the answer. It feels peaceful there. I couldn't speak. I stared at my coffee cup because suddenly my eyes were full of tears again. She folded the paper carefully and smiled. I wanted you to know that you've been helping my son more than you probably realize. That afternoon taught me one of the biggest lessons of my life. We often believe we're changing the world through dramatic moments, but sometimes the greatest influence comes from ordinary kindness repeated over and over again. A warm greeting, a patient conversation, a table where everyone has a place to sit. Family researchers often describe the importance of emotional safety inside everyday relationships. People open their hearts when they know they won't immediately be criticized, interrupted, or judged. Looking back, I realized I hadn't created anything extraordinary. I had simply created consistency. Every teenager who entered our home knew they would hear the same simple words. Hi, come in. Are you hungry? How was your day? Those questions sound almost too ordinary to matter, yet they became the reason our home felt different. That realization unexpectedly changed the way I viewed English too. For years I believed fluency meant speaking perfectly. But sitting across from another mother that afternoon, I noticed something far more important. Neither of us was trying to impress the other with sophisticated vocabulary. We were simply sharing gratitude. Real conversations don't require perfect grammar. They require genuine attention. That's why my English slowly became more natural. Instead of memorizing difficult expressions, I repeated the same warm phrases every day until they became part of who I was. Take your time. I'm glad you're here. Would you like some coffee? Tell me about your day. Those simple sentences connected people long before they improved my pronunciation. I often tell friends that language grows best inside real life. Every dinner, every neighborhood conversation, every school event, every smile exchanged with another parent became another quiet English lesson. I stopped fearing mistakes because I realized communication isn't about performing. It's about connecting. The mother across from me eventually laughed and admitted something unexpected. You know, she said, I thought your house must be perfect. I looked around at the dishes still sitting in the sink, the shoes by the door, the dog toys scattered across the floor, and the fingerprints decorating the refrigerator. I couldn't help laughing. Perfect. I smiled. You picked the wrong house. She laughed with me, and somehow that made the conversation even more meaningful. Before leaving, she paused at the front door and said something I will never forget. Thank you for reminding me that teenagers don't need perfect parents. They need peaceful ones. After she drove away, I stood quietly by the window thinking about those words. Peaceful, not perfect. Maybe that was the real secret hidden behind the phrase cool mom all along. Not younger. Not trendier. Not funnier. Simply someone who made life feel a little lighter for the people who walked through her door. But I still had one final surprise waiting for me. That evening, while cleaning the kitchen after dinner, my husband handed me my son's phone charger. He forgot this, he said with a grin. Wrapped around the charging cable was a tiny folded sticky note written in my son's handwriting. I smiled before opening it, completely unaware that those few handwritten words would become the most unforgettable ending to this entire journey. A happy family isn't perfect. I smiled before opening the tiny sticky note, expecting something ordinary like, Mom, don't forget to wash my hoodie, or I'll be home by 9. That would have been completely normal. Instead, the very first line made my eyes fill with tears before I even reached the end. It simply said, thanks for making my friends feel like they have another family. I read it again, slower this time. Then I turned the note over, wondering if there was more. There wasn't. Just that one sentence. Short. Honest. Powerful. Somehow, it carried more meaning than the longest letter I had ever received. I leaned against the kitchen counter, holding that tiny piece of paper as though it might disappear if I let go. It suddenly became clear why my husband had smiled every time another group of teenagers showed up at our front door. He had understood something long before I did. Our son hadn't been inviting his friends over because we had the best food or the biggest television. He had been sharing something much more valuable. He had been sharing the feeling of home. That realization changed the way I looked at my entire marriage. People often ask couples who have stayed together for many years what their secret is. They expect dramatic answers about romance, grand vacations, or perfect compatibility. Honestly, our story is much simpler. We stopped trying to build the perfect family years ago. Instead, we focused on building a peaceful one. Those are two very different goals. A perfect family only exists in carefully edited social media posts. A peaceful family exists in real kitchens where someone accidentally burns the toast, someone forgets to buy milk. Someone apologizes after speaking too quickly, and everyone eventually laughs about it. My husband and I still disagree sometimes. We still get tired after long workdays. We still forget birthdays, misplace car keys, and occasionally wonder who finished the last scoop of ice cream without replacing it. But over the years, we discovered something that quietly transformed our relationship. Every disagreement offered us two choices. We could protect our pride, or we could protect our peace. Surprisingly, peace usually turned out to be the better investment. Family psychologists often explain that children learn emotional habits by watching adults solve everyday problems. They don't just hear what parents say. They observe how parents react when life becomes inconvenient. Do we blame each other? Do we stay respectful? Do we admit mistakes? Looking back now, I realize those ordinary moments taught our son more about love than any speech ever could. He didn't grow up believing marriage means never arguing. He grew up believing marriage means always finding your way back to kindness. That lesson quietly spread beyond our own family without us even noticing. Watching my son treat his friends with patience reminded me of watching my husband patiently listen to me after difficult days. Respect travels through generations almost invisibly. One calm conversation at a time. One apology at a time. One shared meal at a time. Perhaps that's why our home slowly became a place where teenagers felt safe enough to relax. Nobody expected perfection. We simply expected everyone to treat each other with dignity. Around the same time, I noticed something that made me smile for another reason. My English no longer felt like something I had to practice. It had become part of everyday family life. I caught myself naturally saying things like, "I'm proud of you, everything will be okay, drive safely, and see you tomorrow." Years earlier, I would have worried about choosing exactly the right words. Now the words arrived naturally because they were connected to genuine emotion instead of memorized grammar rules. That may be one of the most beautiful ways to learn a language. Not by chasing perfection, but by living it one conversation at a time. My husband walked into the kitchen later that evening and noticed the sticky note still sitting beside my coffee mug. "You read it," he said with a knowing smile. I nodded quietly. Why didn't he ever say these things out loud? I asked. My husband laughed softly. Because teenagers rarely make speeches. They leave clues. We both laughed together because it was absolutely true. Teenagers don't always express love in obvious ways. Sometimes it's a text message. Sometimes it's an eye roll followed by, "Thanks, Mom." Sometimes it's inviting friends back to the same house every weekend. And sometimes it's one handwritten sentence tucked around a phone charger. Before going to bed that night, I slipped both notes, the anonymous one and my son's sticky note, into the same kitchen drawer. Not because I wanted to hide them, but because I wanted to remember them exactly where this story had unfolded. Every time I opened that drawer afterward, I would remember that ordinary days often carry extraordinary meaning. Still, there was one final conversation waiting for me, one that would tie every piece of this journey together. The next morning, as my family gathered around the breakfast table, my son looked at me, smiled in a way I had never seen before, and asked a question so unexpected that it would become the perfect ending to the story of how two simple words, "Cool Mom," changed the way I saw myself forever. I couldn't stop smiling. The next morning felt completely ordinary, which is probably why I never expected it to become the moment I would remember for the rest of my life. The coffee was brewing. My husband was reading the news on his tablet. The dog was patiently waiting for someone to accidentally drop a piece of toast. My son walked into the kitchen, grabbed a bowl of cereal, sat across from me, and smiled in a way that immediately caught my attention. It wasn't the smile teenagers usually give when they're about to ask for money or borrow the car. It was different. Calm. Genuine. Then he asked, "Mom, can my friends come over again this Friday?" I laughed. Of course they can. They practically live here already. He smiled even wider before quietly adding the sentence that became the real ending of this story. They don't come because of the games. They come because they like who you are. I didn't answer right away because there was nothing I could possibly say that would equal the gift of hearing those words. After everything I had questioned about myself, after every night I had wondered whether I was doing enough as a wife, as a mother, and as the person trying to hold our family together, my own son had unknowingly given me the only answer I had ever needed. Not with a speech. Not during a special holiday. Just over a bowl of cereal on an ordinary morning. That's how life usually works, isn't it? The moments that change us rarely announce themselves. They quietly arrive disguised as everyday conversations. Looking back now, I finally understand why hearing "Cool Mom" made me smile all day. It was never really about sounding young or fashionable. It wasn't about being popular with teenagers. It wasn't even about receiving a compliment. Those two words represented something much deeper. They reminded me that love often grows in silence long before it is spoken aloud. Every packed lunch. Every late-night conversation. Every patient answer. Every family dinner. Every ride home after practice. Every warm welcome at the front door. None of those moments seemed extraordinary when they happened. Together, they became the story my son and his friends would remember. Living in the United States has also taught me something beautiful about family life. Many people assume happiness comes from having a perfect schedule, a perfect house, or perfect children. But the families I admire most don't chase perfection. They create connection. They say, "I'm listening," more often than "I told you so." They protect relationships more carefully than they protect appearances. They understand that respect grows through everyday actions instead of dramatic speeches. That lesson quietly transformed my marriage too. My husband and I stopped asking whether we were perfect parents years ago. Instead, we ask a much simpler question. Did our home feel safe today? If the answer is yes, then we're probably doing better than we think. Family researchers often remind us that emotional safety becomes one of the strongest predictors of healthy relationships throughout life. Children who consistently experience kindness, respect, and reliable support often carry those habits into their own friendships, marriages, and future families. That thought fills me with hope because it means the smallest acts of love are never truly small. They continue traveling long after we forget them ourselves. The same idea changed how I think about learning English. At first, I believed fluency depended on memorizing difficult grammar and thousands of vocabulary words. Now I know something much simpler. Language grows through connection. Every genuine conversation becomes practice. Every smile becomes confidence. Every ordinary phrase like, "How was your day?" "I'm proud of you," "Take care," or "You're always welcome here," carries far more value than perfect grammar spoken without kindness. If you're learning English today, don't wait until you sound perfect before speaking. Speak with sincerity. Listen with curiosity. Build real conversations. That's how confidence quietly grows. Sometimes the best English lesson isn't found inside a textbook. Sometimes it's hidden inside a family story that reminds us what truly matters. Every now and then, I still open that kitchen drawer and look at the two notes resting side by side. One from an anonymous teenager. One from my own son. I don't keep them because I need proof anymore. I keep them because they remind me that people often appreciate us long before they know how to say it. If you're watching this today and you've ever wondered whether your kindness matters, whether your family notices your effort, or whether the ordinary things you do every day make any difference, I hope my story gives you the answer I spent years searching for. They notice more than they say. They remember more than they show. And sometimes, when you least expect it, two simple words can heal doubts you've carried for years. As for me, every time I hear someone laugh in my kitchen, Every time another teenager says, "Thanks for having us," or every time my son casually smiles before leaving with his friends, I remember that unforgettable afternoon. Someone called me cool mom, and somehow I still can't stop smiling. That's all for today. I'll make many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.